Constantinople, the morning after the 29th of May, 1453. Dawn breaks over an empty square. Bells that should be ringing stay silent. Smoke still rises somewhere along the northwest wall, from a fortification that had stood, unbroken, for 11 centuries and had just torn open in a single night. Every account of this day starts with the same number, 53. 53 days of siege, from the 6th of April to the 29th of May. Cannon fire against stone, day after day, until the stone finally gave way. But that is the wrong place to start this particular story. The wall that broke that morning had already been dying for 382 years, ever since a battlefield 1,000 miles to the east, at a place called Manzikert. This is probably the version you already know. One catastrophic siege, a doomed last stand, a city that ran out of luck one morning in May. It is not wrong, exactly. It is just missing the first 380 years. So here is the real question. What actually killed an empire that had outlasted 1,000 years of sieges, invasions, and plagues? Not 53 days of cannon fire. 382 years nobody wanted to admit a wound that never healed. After Manzikert, in 1071, Byzantium did not collapse. It did something slower, and in the end, more fatal. It survived, and kept turning on itself. 3 times over the next 3.5 centuries, the empire looked as though it had finally found its footing again. And 3 times, it tore a piece of itself away with its own hands. In 1204, crusaders sailing under the Christian cross sacked Constantinople outright and installed a foreign emperor on its own throne, an injury the city never fully forgave and never fully recovered from. When Byzantine rule finally returned in 1261, it returned to a smaller, poorer capital, ruling a smaller, poorer realm. Through the 14th century, a series of civil wars between rival claimants to the throne, cousins and in-laws fighting cousins and in-laws for a crown that was worth less every decade, burned through what little strength the restored empire had managed to rebuild. And through all of it, Ottoman power kept expanding into the vacuum next door, absorbing Byzantine territory across Anatolia and the Balkans piece by piece, often without needing to fight for it at all. By the middle of the 15th century, what still called itself the Roman Empire was little more than a strip of coastline wrapped around a single city. Constantinople sat like an island inside Ottoman land, a capital with almost nothing left outside its own walls to actually be capital of. Even the city itself had shrunk to a fraction of what it once was. Modern estimates put its population at well under 50,000. Some studies argue closer to 40, down from roughly 500,000 people at its height centuries earlier. Inside the Great Walls, whole neighborhoods stood empty. Where imperial gardens had once bloomed, there were now vegetable plots and grazing goats, tucked between churches too large for the congregations left to fill them. Visitors from Italy who had heard tales of Constantinople's splendor sometimes arrived to find a city that looked, in places, closer to a scatter of villages than an imperial capital. Across the strait, the Ottomans were doing the opposite of Byzantium. They were consolidating, not fracturing. A crusade raised specifically to stop them broke at Varna in 1444. A second defeat, at Kosovo in 1448, ended the last organized field army Christian Europe could still put together on short notice. In 1451, a 19-year-old named Mehmed II inherited the Ottoman throne for the second time in his life, having briefly held it once before as a boy. Unlike his father, he arrived this time with exactly one ambition, and he was patient about it in a way few people around him expected. Mehmed moved like a man playing chess, not a man on crusade. He signed treaties with Venice, Genoa, and Hungary, buying their neutrality one court at a time, one concession at a time. A rebellion by the Karamanids in Anatolia, of all things, gave him the breathing room to secure his eastern border first, before turning fully toward the city he actually wanted. And when Emperor Constantine Dayhav, desperate to end the tribute payments crushing what remained of his treasury, threatened to back a rival claimant to the Ottoman throne, Mehmed finally had the excuse he needed. The old treaty was declared void, and preparations that had likely begun already were now made official. But the real reason Constantinople stood alone in the spring of 1453 was not diplomacy, and it was not simple military weakness either. It was a belief nearly 1,000 years old, that the Theodosian walls could not be broken. Byzantines believed it, even as their empire shrank to almost nothing around it. Most of Europe believed it too. Foreign visitors still described the city's defenses as the great unbreakable shield of Christendom, long after the empire sheltering behind that shield had become a shell of one, a name, a throne, and a wall, and not much else. The walls had earned that reputation, honestly. Avar and Persian armies together had failed to take the city in 626. Arab armies had tried twice, in the 670s and again in 717, and failed both times. Raiders from the north had failed in the 9th century. Even the Ottomans themselves had already tried and failed once before, in 1422, under Mehmed's own father. 11 centuries, and the walls had never once been broken by force from the outside. That record was not superstition. It was history, and it was exactly the kind of history that makes people stop asking hard questions about maintenance. And that belief, not the overconfidence of a single commander, but the complacency of an entire civilization toward its own greatest achievement, is exactly why, for 1,000 years, almost nobody had bothered to ask which stretch of that wall was weakest. There was one fact about those walls that almost nobody watching from the outside ever learned. Along the middle stretch of the Theodosian walls, where a small river called the Lycus cut through the ridgeline, the ground itself dipped, and so did the wall built on top of it. This section, known as the Mesotikion, sat lower than the high ground facing it from the Ottoman side. For 1,000 years, no attacking army had ever assembled enough sustained firepower in one place to make that difference matter. Mehmed intended to be the first. In the spring of 1452, he ordered a new fortress raised on the European shore of the Bosphorus to seal off any relief that might come by sea from the Black Sea. Rumilithisar went up in a little over 4 months, an almost absurd pace for a structure of that scale, worked by thousands of laborers racing the deadline. Around the same time, an engineer named Orban, who had once tried and failed to sell his services to Constantine himself, began casting cannons for the Sultan instead. Among them was a bombard so massive it needed dozens of oxen and hundreds of men simply to drag into position outside the walls. Contemporary chroniclers claimed Mehmed brought over 100,000 men. Modern historians put the real figure closer to 60 or 80,000, still overwhelming against a garrison of only a few thousand professional soldiers. Inside the city, the defenders prepared with what little they had. They repaired stonework that had not been properly maintained in decades. They stretched a heavy iron chain across the mouth of the Golden Horn, floated on wooden pontoons, to keep enemy ships away from the weaker seawalls to the north. A force of several hundred Genoese soldiers arrived under the mercenary commander Giovanni Giustiniani, nearly the only substantial foreign help that would ever come, despite months of pleas sent to every court in Europe that might listen. And in one of the stranger footnotes of the entire siege, several hundred Ottoman soldiers arrived too, loyal not to Mehmed but to Prince Orhan, a rival claimant to the Ottoman throne who had spent years living as a hostage inside Byzantine territory. He would fight, and eventually die, on the side of the very empire that had once held him captive. One loyalty, at least, undivided. Inside the walls themselves, that was rare. Months earlier, in a desperate bid for Western military help, Constantine had allowed a formal union between the Orthodox and Catholic churches to be proclaimed at Hagia Sophia itself. Many of his own subjects treated the ceremony as a betrayal of their faith rather than a diplomatic necessity, and stayed away from the cathedral in protest, even with the enemy already camped outside the walls. The empire was dying, divided over exactly what it meant to save itself and who had the right to decide. Constantine himself chose where to make his stand. Of all the positions along 19 kilometers of wall, he placed his own household troops at the Mesotikion, the one stretch that everyone, quietly, understood to be the weakest. On the 1st of April, 1453, Ottoman forces began arriving outside the walls. The Sultan himself arrived on the 5th. By the 6th, his guns were in position, and the bombardment began. Neither side yet knew exactly how much that one lower stretch of wall was about to matter. For the first days, the bombardment achieved less than either side expected. Orban's great cannon could fire only a handful of times a day. Reloading took hours, not minutes, and each night the garrison filled the fresh gaps with earth, timber, anything that would hold. On the 7th of April, Ottoman light infantry tested the walls directly and were thrown back without much difficulty. Byzantine defenders even risked short sorties of their own on the 8th and 9th, probing the siege lines and slipping back behind their gates each time before the Ottomans could respond in force. Cannon against shovel, assault against sortie. For weeks, against every expectation, the defense was winning that exchange. On the water, the story went differently. The chain across the Golden Horn held, and Mehmed's fleet could not force it, even after a handful of Venetian relief ships slipped past the blockade on the 20th of April to reinforce the defenders. So Mehmed did something almost nobody expected. He had dozens of ships dragged over land, on greased rollers, over the hills behind the Genoese colony of Pera, and lowered back into the water on the far side of the chain on the 28th of April. It was not the improvisation it looked like from inside the city. Preparations for the maneuver had begun months earlier, but the effect on the defenders was the same either way. A desperate attempt to burn the Ottoman ships with fire vessels failed within days, and from that point on, Byzantine troops were needed on 2 fronts instead of 1. The garrison guarding the Lycus Valley grew thinner, night after night, as men were pulled away to cover the new threat. Early in May, Orban's largest gun, the one weapon truly capable of doing damage to the Theodosian walls at range, broke down entirely. For several days it sat silent, and inside the city, hope briefly, foolishly, returned. By the 6th of May it had been repaired, and the bombardment against the Mesotikion resumed with, if anything, more intensity than before. Days later, Ottoman troops briefly broke through part of the Karizian gate defenses further north before being pushed back in the dark, a warning of how thin the whole perimeter had already become. Day after day, the guns came back to the same stretch of wall, not the strongest section, not a random one, the one that had always been the weakest, and the one where Constantine himself now stood, with the men he trusted most. By the last week of May, that stretch of wall was barely a wall at all. Inside the city, advisors urged Constantine to escape while ships could still slip out, to preserve at least a government in exile somewhere in the west. He refused. He would defend the city he ruled, or he would die inside it. There would be no third option. Inside the Ottoman camp, not everyone agreed the assault should even go ahead. After 7 weeks with no result, some of Mehmed's own advisors argued for lifting the siege before a relief fleet from the west could arrive and trap the army against the walls. Mehmed overruled them. Before dawn on the 29th, he ordered a final, general assault along the entire land wall. Wave after wave went forward. Irregular troops first, pushed on from behind by their own officers, whether they wanted to advance or not. Then regular soldiers from Anatolia. Then, when both of those had been fought to exhaustion, the Janissaries. Ladders went up against stone, still warm from the day's bombardment. Torches, shouting in half a dozen languages. Hour by hour, the gap at the Mesotikion grew wider. The defenders held, for a while. Here the sources start to disagree, and the disagreement matters, because it changes what kind of story this becomes. One account, from the Byzantine historian Dukas, claims that a small side gate near the wall, left unbolted after an earlier night sortie, let a handful of Ottoman soldiers slip inside, where they raised a banner and triggered a panic among the defenders below. Generations of later historians who trusted dukas repeated the story for centuries afterward. Other scholars reject it almost entirely and argue that no open gate was needed at all, that the wall at the Mesoteikion had simply been battered past the point of holding, and the Janissaries broke through exactly where months of bombardment, not one night's carelessness, had already done the work for them. Both versions agree on the location. Both versions agree on the outcome. Giustiniani, defending that exact stretch, was struck and severely wounded. He was carried from the wall down to a ship in the harbor, and when the soldiers around him saw their commander go, the line they were holding did not last much longer after that. What happened to Constantine Sev next is genuinely unclear, and this video will not pretend otherwise. No eyewitness who stood beside him in his final moments survived to describe them afterward. Later accounts, some sympathetic, some hostile, none of them actually present, describe him tearing off his imperial regalia so he would not be captured alive, and vanishing into the fighting near the breach. His body was never conclusively identified. By midday, the banners flying above the Theodosian walls had changed. A line of Roman emperors that began with Constantine the Great in the 4th century ended with another Constantine in the wreckage of the one stretch of wall neither of them had ever quite managed to finish building. What followed happened in hours, not days. Ottoman soldiers poured through the breach and along the northern sea walls, and 3 days of pillage began. The customary price, under the military convention of the age, for a city that had refused every offer to surrender rather than fight to the end. Roughly 33,000 residents were taken captive in the chaos, and countless others were killed outright or scattered into the surrounding countryside before the Sultan finally called a halt to the sack. Prince Orhan, the Ottoman claimant who had spent the siege fighting against his own bloodline, was captured trying to escape the fallen city and executed on Mehmed's direct orders. Giustiniani, carried wounded from the wall he had defended for 53 straight days, died of his injuries within weeks, far from the city he had tried to save. By afternoon, Mehmedi rode through the streets of the city he had just conquered and entered the Hagia Sophia itself, a cathedral for 1,100 years, which would be reconsecrated as a mosque before the week was out. The line of Roman emperors that had run, in some form, since Augustus, through Constantine the Great's founding of this very city back in the year 330, finally ended in the wreckage near the Lycus Valley on the 29th of May, 1453. News of the city's fall took weeks to reach Rome and the royal courts of Western Europe. When it did, it landed like a physical blow. The ancient bulwark against the east, gone, and almost nobody outside the city had lifted more than a token hand to prevent it. What is worth sitting with here is not the speed of the collapse. It is the contrast in timescales. The wall took a single morning to fall. The empire behind it had been dying for 382 years, and almost no one who lived through those long years ever called it dying. They called it enduring. Historians still call 1453 a hinge point, the symbolic close of the medieval world, part of what sent Greek scholars westward carrying manuscripts that had grown rare or forgotten in Latin Europe, feeding into a Renaissance already gathering pace in Florence and Venice. That framing is common, and it makes for a tidy ending. It is not, however, uncontested. How much of that westward wave genuinely depended on 1453, rather than trends already well underway, is exactly the kind of question historians still argue about, and many argue more broadly that the medieval to modern boundary was never that clean to begin with, and that 1453 matters more as an ending in itself than as the direct cause of anything that followed it. What is harder to argue with is the counterfactual sitting quietly underneath this whole story. If the wall at the Mesoteikion had ever been rebuilt to match the strength of the rest of the circuit, If the empire behind it had spent even one of those 3.5 centuries healing instead of feuding with itself. There is no guarantee the 29th of May, 1453, plays out the same way at all. Perhaps a different weak point falls a generation later. Perhaps none ever does. So, what actually killed an empire that had outlasted 1,000 years of sieges? Not 53 days of cannon fire, 382 years nobody wanted to admit a wound that never healed. On a map, right up until the final week, that empire still looked like it belonged there. A line of coastline, a capital city, a name 11 centuries old. Inside, it had been hollow for far longer than most of its own citizens had ever been alive to remember otherwise. And Constantinople was not quite the final chapter. 2 fragments of this empire outlived its capital by years, not centuries. A small despotate tucked into the mountains of southern Greece, and a kingdom on the Black Sea coast that still called itself, all the way to the end, Roman. But if you want to see where all of this actually began, not the ending, but the very first crack, the video on Manzikert, 1071, is where this particular story starts.